So talking about brains in particular, so you can then represent all kinds of computation principally in a Turing machine, but what something is lost mechanistically along the way. Is that the idea? That like you can't upload your brain into a Turing machine and expect it to survive, right?
Oh.
That's I'm sorry, I'm steering a bit into to pop culture here, but
No, 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 no. That's good. Well, um, there are a lot of things to say there. One is that if you try to model or figure out what a brain does just by using something like a digital computer, yeah, you miss a lot of what you need to understand biological cognition, including possibly the tight interconnection between the representations and the computations. Now you can build models of that, and that's fine. But a model is not the same as the original. So I mean, models like you do in all sciences. That's fine, of course. Now, what about uploading our mind into a computer? So I wrote a paper about that, as you might know, and in there I argue that um, it's a lot harder than people think to build a realistic model of an individual brain down to the level of the personality of the brain. There are so many complications there because there are just so many parts connected in so many ways. We don't fully understand how the system works. Um, there are so many idealizations and simplifications that go into building models like that. You need so much computational power, and you need to intervene on the system so invasively that you end up probably damaging it before you can even have enough information to do this, and on and on. There are a lot of difficulties in doing anything like building a realistic model of an individual brain down to the level of their personality and idiosyncrasies. That's that's the first problem. The second problem is that even if you could do that, there's no reason to believe that the model would like acquire consciousness. Just because you're building this, artificial model of a brain, that doesn't give it consciousness the way a brain actually has it. We don't, as I was saying earlier, we don't really understand the physical basis of consciousness, and I haven't heard any good reason to believe that all it is performing a certain type of computation of the sort that even a model of the brain would perform. Um, so that's problem number two. It probably wouldn't be conscious. And then problem number three is it wouldn't be the same person. Even if it were conscious, it still wouldn't be the same person because it would just be a copy. You could do that without eliminating the original in principle. And so you would have this copy there, and maybe it would function similarly, and I doubt it would be conscious. But even if it were conscious, it would just be somebody else. And maybe some people like to have copies of themselves, but it's not the same as uploading themselves into a computer. But that's how people sometimes talk, like uploading our mind into a computer. That's not what would happen. What would happen is we would create a copy of us. So the one kind of special case is if we were to replace parts of our brain with artifacts. So in that case, we would be maintaining some sort of integrity of the one system. It's different from building a model inside a computer. It's like we replace, there are prostheses for say cochlear implants and retinal implants. So can continue that process, like just replace all the parts of the brain with artifacts. Then wouldn't we have uploaded our mind into a computer in a sense? And um maybe, but I don't think that's a feasible process either um, because first of all, it's too invasive. There's too much damage, and second, besides the fact that we don't know how to do that, and we certainly don't know how to build things like that would preserve consciousness because we don't even understand what it takes to be conscious. But also, there are 100 billion neurons. How are you going to replace all of them? It would take, if you're doing it one at a time, like some people sometimes say, like, oh, just do one neuron at a time. Really? That would be 100 billion surgeries.
Yeah.
That's a lot of surgeries. That would take like thousands of years. So then you can do it like maybe a few neurons at a time, but that's still too many. So it's not a very serious.
It's also just kind of ethically horrifying. Like you're gonna hurt someone if you're trying to do that.
That's right.
and,
Okay, but AI. What about AI?
and sorry, just one thing I thought of as
Yeah,
well is energy requirements. Like I was speaking with Paul Thagard the other day, and he wrote a paper recently on the fact
I
that
saw
even
that.
if you consider everything, will Turing machines still function on the assumption that there's an infinite tape? You need so much computation that it's just not practically a feasible idea.
Yeah, good. Yes, I saw that paper. Good.
Where do you think all the confusion about how AI is popularly discussed is coming from?
So AI. Um, i- well, yeah, we've always been fascinated by this kind of idea. Can we make an intelligent machine? And um, there's nothing wrong in principle with trying to build an intelligent machine. But people tend to oversimplify in general. I mean, look at like how we're surrounded by conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are just like the ultimate oversimplification of the world. Oh yeah, this is why this is happening because, somebody is there like trying to make it happen that way. Well, lots and lots of things happen without anybody trying to make it happen exactly that way. There's all kinds of interesting, complicated interaction um, between lots of um, different things, different facts, different phenomena that um, produce certain effects. But we often prefer a simpler explanation, and a lot of times we totally botch it. But I mean, when it comes to AI, people have been wrong on both sides. So the early AI theorists said, "Oh, we're going to have an intelligent machine in 10 years, or 20 years, or whatever, a general problem solver," and then they didn't. But then on the other side, people said, "Oh, this is never going to work. They're never going to like beat a chess grandmaster, or they're never going to beat the best Go player in the world because that's too creative. That kind of game is too complicated for machines." And they did. So um, we should try to be humble and curious and see how far we've gotten and what can we extrapolate from that, not just, oh yeah, with more scale and more computing power we'll just have the singularity and computers will be smarter than people. We don't even know what the basis of consciousness is, what consciousness contributes to cognition. We don't fully understand creativity and intelligence. So yeah, I think there's a good chance that AI will continue to progress. It certainly made a lot of progress. I'm quite impressed with it. But before we try to extrapolate all the way to things like the singularity, we should be a little more humble and a little more cautious.
Right? And do you think that as AI gets more successful, it moves closer to biology, or it takes biology more and more seriously? Like at least that's kind of been the trend over the years that you went from sort of abstract symbol systems to trying to build networks that more mimic the biological reality. So I mean, is there a reason to assume that that continues?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because um, a lot of the recent success of AI comes from um, essentially artificial neural networks, which in many ways do work in a way that's more similar to brains or to biological neural networks both the older neural networks and certainly even more the old like expert systems, AI systems from the 70s and 80s. Um, so yes, it's come closer to biology, but then in other ways it's moved away from biology. For example, by using labeled data sets that are huge and rely on maybe the whole internet sometimes for uh, gathering data, or these like giant data collecting um, you know enterprises that can be used to feed these networks. So, or or like satellite systems for self-driving cars. So yeah, like people do self-driving cars and they use neural networks to do it, but it's not neural networks that are on their own navigating the system like our own or those that operate in a mouse, but rather they're hooked up to all these like external support systems like you know GPS and the internet, uh, or pre-built maps of the environment, so that they can use all that information, all those data, to help them do what they're supposed to do. So yeah, in some ways it's coming close to biology, but in other ways it's using this infrastructure, this digital infrastructure that a normal biological system doesn't doesn't get to use. So
I mean, if I'm thinking about it, it probably is just the idea that, well, in industry, data has grown seriously and biology has grown seriously. So maybe it's just the fact that AI will follow industry trends, or AI will follow the resources that industry makes available to it.
definitely, yeah, and I mean, more power to them. I mean, of course, it's an amazing thing. But it's just important to realize that um, although it's analogous to biological system in some ways, it's also different in other ways.
It can solve the problem of original content.
Well, it's not going to solve it all by itself, and we should be aware of where there's derivative content that's fed into these machines, because like the internet itself was also ultimately created by people. And so if you're going to rely on that to train these machines, you're already kind of injecting existing content into the training for these machines. So these machines are not building content just on their own. They're relying on content that's already existing, that's been labeled in certain ways, organized in certain ways by people who understand it.
So what about then like robotics and cybernetic systems? That people who are uh, in 4E, or I should say 4EA cognition, stress that putting those kinds of models in robotic systems might begin to mirror human reality further.
Yes, I do think there's a lot to that. And recently, when I was working on this one paper on neural representation that I mentioned earlier, I looked a little bit at state of the art robotics. And one of the most impressive things I found was this robotic hand that can solve Rubik's Cube. I think at least 60% of the time, not always, but like a large proportion of the time, with just one hand. Okay. This is something that would be very difficult to do for a human being. I mean, solving the Rubik's Cube is very difficult, and you using only one hand would be very, very difficult. I mean, just in terms of manual dexterity. Um, so I thought this was very impressive. And it turns out that to train this robotic hand, they have to use an artificial environment. They cannot train it in the real world. And the reason is there, to put it, in a simplified way, there are just way too many degrees of freedom for the network to be able to handle them in the real world. Whereas if they simplify the environment by creating sort of an artificial environment, then the network can learn to do this. And once it's learned to do it in the artificial environment, then it can do it in the real world. Um, so I think, this does carry some interesting lessons. One, an embodied neural network that's embedded in the real world does acquire something at least similar that goes in the direction of original semantic content, but the way that it does is still interestingly different from the way the brain does, because they don't know how to make it learn from the actual real world where it would be really embedded in the real world. Instead, they have to create an artificial environment and embed it in the artificial environment first. Then it learns, then it can operate in the real world. So there's still an interesting gap there between, what a biological brain can do and what state of the art robotic systems can do.
So is it then just about constraining reality in some way to make it more combinatorially manageable? That the brain is model building, it's doing inference in some sense, in the logical sense, but something is constrained somehow.
Yeah, probably. And we don't understand how the brain does it yet.